Early in the morning on February 5th, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlinok stood in the kitchen of her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment making some coffee. Mornings were the best part of Laverne's day because she had the whole apartment to herself. Now, she lived with her boyfriend, John Sosnovsky, but he worked at a nearby mill and had to be out early in order to catch the bus there. And each time he left, Laverne felt like a huge weight lifted off of her. Because when John wasn't home, Laverne could go about her day and pretend she was safe. But that's all it was pretend. John, in reality, was an incredibly violent man. I mean, he was seriously physically abusive, especially when he was drunk, which was basically all the time. So Laverne had actually been married, but her husband had died of cancer, and she had ultimately met John following her husband's death. And so when they met, Laverne was very vulnerable and lonely, and she really hadn't realized the kind of person John was until it was too late. It had been 10 years now, and Laverne still had not, built up the courage to leave him. I mean, the reality was she was just scared of how he would react, and so she sort of felt trapped. Now, she sat down at her kitchen table with her coffee, and she opened up the local paper. And as soon as she did, the first thing she saw was a big black and white photo of a smiling young woman who likely was in her 20s. The photo was connected to an article about a recent murder that happened 30 miles away, just northeast of Portland. The victim had been identified as a woman named Tanya Bennett, and Tanya Bennett was the girl in the photo. The article said she had been beaten and then also strangled with a rope, and then she had been left on the side of the highway. And when Laverne read about the area she actually had been, dumped, she realized it actually was only about 1.5 miles down from this famous scenic overlook that Laverne had actually been to before. Like, she was familiar with this area. And so Laverne, she's reading the article and she's looking at this picture back and forth, and it was like something was sort of forming in her mind. She just had like this weird sense that she knew something about this case. And then as she stared at this photo for a little bit longer, it's like it all came together. And she realized almost certainly that she knew John very likely killed this woman. And so even though she loved her peaceful, quiet mornings with her coffee, Laverne immediately stood up, she grabbed the phone, and she called the police. After she hung up with police, Laverne was very shaken up. I mean, her heart was still racing. I mean, this was a very risky thing she was doing because she had no way of knowing if what she had just given authorities was enough to arrest John. If it wasn't, it was entirely possible that John would discover this betrayal of her calling the police about him, implicating him in a murder, and he would probably just continue his abuse, if not amp up his abuse of Laverne. And so the way she saw it is either what she just did was going to end the chapter with John and he was going to go to jail for murder, or Laverne might wind up being the next dead girl on the side of the highway. A little over a week later, on the morning of February 16th, Detective John Ingram sat with his partner in a very clean living room in Wilsonville, Oregon. Ingram was the lead investigator on Tanya Bennett's murder case, and he was there to speak to Laverne, who was sitting on the opposite couch. And Laverne seemed really nervous and kept fidgeting constantly and offering Ingram and his partner refreshments. It was just very clear that there was a lot on this woman's mind. So Ingram knew that Laverne had a week earlier called in a tip about the victim's killer. She thought it was her own boyfriend, John Sosnovsky. And right now, Ingram was very eager to hear what she had to say about her boyfriend, to basically elaborate and sort of give the full story of why she believed what she believed, in part because Ingram's case so far had absolutely no other leads. Like, this was it. The victim's body had been found on a grassy slope so close to the edge of the highway that you could see her from the road. But Ingram and his partner had not been able to find any witnesses. A few people had claimed to have seen Tanya along with some man at a bar earlier in the night before she went missing, but no one had been able to effectively describe that man. It was just some guy she was with. And so Ingram and his partner had basically talked to just about anyone they could think of that might have known Tanya. They'd canvassed her neighborhood, they'd interviewed her family, coworkers, friends, and they still had not been able to find anybody who fit as a suspect. They also hadn't found any good physical evidence at the scene, like fingerprints or helpful forensics. So now, Ingram was hoping that Laverne was going to be the key to his whole case. And so eventually, Ingram looked at Laverne and said, "Whenever you're ready, tell me what you know. Tell me the story of why you believe John killed Tanya. Now, at first, Laverne just continued to squirm in her seat, and she was, obviously very nervous, but eventually, after Ingram told her to just, take a breath, calm down, it's okay, we just want to hear your story, eventually, with a shaking voice, she told them that on the night of the murder, John had come home around maybe 1 or 2 in the morning and immediately got in the shower. Now, this was unusual. I mean, this is not something that he typically did. He didn't shower at 2 in the morning. But Laverne really hadn't thought much of it until the next day when they went to a local bar, and she'd literally overheard John bragging to somebody about murdering Tanya, describing how he had picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then took her to the highway by Columbia River Gorge to dump her body by this scenic overlook. As Laverne spoke, Ingram and his partner were shocked. Basically, Laverne had overheard effectively a confession, and the details of that confession did seem to line up with what they had heard so far. Tanya had been seen out late at night with some man, although nobody could really describe the man. And also, where her body was found, it was near the scenic overlook, something that was, publicly known, but still, that's what Laverne heard John say. It lined up. But he kept a poker face and just told Laverne to please keep going, keep elaborating. And so Laverne, she continued speaking, and she went on to say that the reason she didn't come forward right away was because she was scared of John. He was a violent alcoholic who abused her, which is also part of the reason why this seemed real to her. She was totally not shocked at the idea that maybe John killed someone, but she was basically fearful that he might kill her too. And so she had kept it to herself until she had seen the article in the paper and also saw the picture of the girl, and she just looked so young and innocent, and she just couldn't help but feel like she owed it to that girl to come forward. Now, at this point, Ingram's mind was whirling. If this was all true, it was huge for this case. Potentially, this just solved the whole murder. This is what happened potentially. But he also knew, right now, it was just one woman's story. He needed actual proof. He couldn't just take Laverne's word for it. So he asked Laverne if he and his partner could just go ahead and search the apartment. And as soon as Laverne nodded, the detectives jumped to their feet and got to work. Laverne led the detectives down the hallway to the master bedroom, and then from there, she backed off and just, let the men get to work. And the detectives, they immediately split up and spread out to cover more ground. Ingram had actually brought along a list of stuff that they were theoretically looking for. And one of the things on his list was a swatch of denim from the front buttons of Tanya's jeans. It had been missing when they found her, like it had been intentionally cut out, which was obviously pretty unusual. And it made him think that Tanya's killer had taken a trophy or something. But after a few minutes of searching around the bedroom, Ingram did not see this denim patch. In fact, he actually didn't see anything at first glance that connected John to Tanya. Until he went over to look through this cardboard box of papers and began sifting through them. And when he pulled out a torn piece of scrap paper and read what was on it, he froze. On this piece of scrap paper was a handwritten message that just said, quote, "T. Bennett, good peace." Ingram immediately called his partner over, who walked over and looked at the note, and both of them are like, okay, obviously, we need to bring John in right away for a chat. But after leaving the bedroom and walking towards the door to leave, who comes in the front door? None other than John Sosnowski. About an hour later, Ingram sat at an interrogation table in the sheriff's office, staring across it at John. And John had a very confused look on his face, but otherwise seemed relatively calm. Back at the apartment, when John had walked in the door and sort of saw the detectives and didn't know what was going on, Ingram had told him who he was and why he was there. And John had really just seemed surprised, but had quickly agreed to go with them to the station if they wanted to speak to him. But Ingram knew from experience that, just because John was acting very cooperative did not mean he was innocent. Now, Ingram slid a picture of Tanya across the table and asked John if he knew who she was or had anything to do with her murder. And John didn't deny it or act horrified or offended to be asked. He just said he didn't really remember. And when Ingram showed him the note they found in his bedroom that said T. Bennett, good peace on it, John just sort of squinted at it and said he really wasn't sure if he wrote that or not. So these were all very straightforward questions, and it was highly suspicious to Ingram that John apparently just couldn't answer them, at least not cleanly. And really the rest of his interview went the same way, with John giving mostly just vague non-answers to everything Ingram asked, no matter how binary the question was supposed to be. And Ingram was just sort of struck by how nonchalant John seemed whenever he responded, even though, he was being questioned about his connection to a murder. This was not a time to be nonchalant. This was a time to be forthcoming. However, despite Ingram's very high suspicion of John, realistically, the only evidence he had on John, at least at this point, was all circumstantial, and so was not nearly enough to actually arrest John. What they needed in order to do that was some form of hard evidence that directly connected him to Tanya's murder. So ultimately, at the end of this interview, despite how weird the whole thing had been, Ingram just sighed and told John that for now, he could go. 4 days later, Ingram had just gotten to his office for the morning when his desk phone rang. He picked up and was surprised to hear Laverne's voice on the other end. But before he could ask her what this was about, Laverne told him she had found something in her car that morning and felt like he needed to see it. And when she told him what this thing was, Ingram said he would be right over. Then he immediately hung up and ran to find his partner. As he drove to Laverne's, he found his heart was racing. Over the last few days, they hadn't found any additional evidence to prove John was their killer. In fact, if anything, they had actually lost some evidence, since that note they found inside of John's things in his house ended up being a dead end, because their analysts couldn't actually match the handwriting to John, so they didn't know for sure if it was him. But now, based on what Laverne had just told him on the phone about what she found in her car, he was pretty much positive that this was the break he needed. Within the hour, Ingram and his partner were standing in Laverne's garage with Laverne staring into the open trunk of her car. Laverne had told Ingram that she kept her car and really her whole life very, very clean, like her apartment's clean, everything's clean all the time. And when she went into her car that day, she noticed there was a little swatch of denim sitting in the trunk. And she knew that she had not put it there, and considering she was sort of on high alert about John and about his connection to this murder, it just seemed like something worth flagging to police. And for Ingram and his partner, as they're staring into the trunk at this little swatch of denim that looks very much like the swatch of denim they were secretly looking for, they had not publicly revealed that the killer had taken a little swatch of denim from Tanya's jeans that was private. They're looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, like this is the break we needed. Clearly, that's the denim from Tanya's jeans. And so Laverne was right to call this in. This is potentially huge. Now, obviously, Ingram knew that they would still have to get this denim tested to make sure it really was Tanya's. It's entirely possible that it was actually Laverne's or John's or was unrelated, but circumstantially, this felt like hitting the jackpot. And so Ingram watched as his partner picked up the swatch, put it into an evidence bag, and then they left and said they would have it tested and they would be in touch. The following morning, Ingram was at his desk reviewing all the evidence that they had so far. And by this point, they had a lot of evidence. The previous night, after finding the denim, they had brought John in for a polygraph test, and he had completely failed it. The test administrator had even noted that, in his opinion, John definitely knew what had happened to Tanya. So now, realistically, Ingram was just sort of waiting on confirmation that that fabric was a match. And then at that point, they could go and arrest John. And when Ingram's phone rang, he picked it up immediately, and it was the lab. And so Ingram sat up straight, ready for some good news. But the tech on the other line sounded sort of glum, and he told Ingram that the denim from Laverne's car did not match the jeans that Tanya was wearing, so it was not hers. And at this, Ingram was just completely stunned. The idea that they had just found the same unique cut of denim in a car in their main suspect's house could not be a coincidence. It was not typical for people to have little swatches of denim lying around. Like, this is not something that you just happen to have. It felt sort of specific. And so there just had to be more to this than met the eye. And even though Ingram tried to work out some kind of reasonable explanation for why that swatch was there, the only thing that actually made sense was that the fake denim was planted there. And so feeling a mix of, again, shock, but also just frustration here. He thought he was so close to solving this thing, and now he was sort of back to square one. Ingram realized that the next stop had to be Laverne's. He needed to go speak to her again. Later that morning, Ingram and his partner were once again back in Laverne's living room with a very nervous-looking Laverne sitting across from them. This time, Ingram was going to be a little tougher on her. because he now knew that, whatever she had told him before very likely was not the full story. And as soon as Ingram asked Laverne point blank if she had planted that evidence, that denim inside of her car, Laverne just kind of looked back at him and her face began to sort of quiver, and then she just started sobbing. And she told them she was so sorry. She explained that she had cut up some jeans and put that front button part in her car and pretended to have found it so that they'd be able to arrest John. She said she had just gotten so worried when they let him go after interviewing him because she knew John killed Tanya. He had to have. She heard him talk about it. Like, he did it and he's dangerous. And she just wanted to make sure the police held him accountable. Now, when Ingram heard this, he could hear the earnestness in her voice. Like, clearly this woman is scared of John and thinks he did this. She believes he did this. And so he wanted to believe her angle here, as inappropriate as planting evidence was. But, critically, he knew Laverne still was definitely not telling him everything, because there was simply no way she could have known to plant that unique cut of the jeans unless she had intimate knowledge of the crime or some other inside information. But there was just something missing here. Why would she randomly choose that front cut of denim as just the evidence? Oh, here's some evidence that's going to make John look guilty. Why would she choose that? That's way too on the nose. And when he pointed this out to Laverne, it was like Laverne's energy completely shifted, from sobbing and sadness and remorse to just pure hesitation. Like, she didn't really know how to react, but there wasn't any more sadness. It was like, uh-oh, something's off here. And then Laverne kind of took a deep breath and she looked at Ingram and she said, I was lying. You're right. My story about planting the evidence, that was a lie. But she went on to say that the reason she had lied was because she had ultimately been too afraid that if the police knew the whole story, that she would get in trouble too. Then Laverne explained what really happened to Tanya. On the night that Tanya was murdered, Laverne said John called her that night and he was sort of frantic. And he said to her that he was in trouble and that she needed to meet him at the bar that he was at and to bring along a shower curtain. And so Laverne said, because she was very scared of John and was just fearful of asking any questions, she had just done what he said. And she got the shower curtain and she had driven out there and she found John in a parking lot standing over a body. It was Tanya. And she was just lying there on the ground, motionless. Laverne said she was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she just helped. She literally helped John put Tanya's body into her car, Laverne's car, wrapped her up in that curtain she'd brought along, and then together they dumped her body at a spot along the highway. But as Laverne continued to talk, her story suddenly got much darker because she actually eventually confessed that Tanya had not been dead when she had first arrived, but instead she was still clinging to life. And at John's request, Laverne had tied rope around Tanya's neck and held it tight while John sexually assaulted her. Laverne said after he was done, Tanya was no longer breathing. Ingram could barely conceal his shock when she explained this. I mean, here was this gentle, soft-spoken lady who was now telling him that she had actively participated in the sexual assault and murder of this young woman. It was hard to wrap his head around it. And at the moment, all Ingram could think was, this can't be real. But what Laverne was saying just fit. It explained John's cagey answers to his questions, his failed polygraph, and how Laverne knew the right part of the jeans to cut out and fake as evidence, because she and John had been the ones who actually made the cut on Tanya's jeans. They knew. But despite getting this earth-shattering confession here, Ingram wanted to be completely sure that this version of the story Laverne was telling him was actually the truth, and he knew exactly how to prove it. The following day, Ingram was behind the wheel of his cruiser next to his partner, and Laverne sat in the back, sort of absent-mindedly staring out the window. They were driving down the highway northeast of Portland, and Ingram had instructed Laverne to let him know when they reached the spot where they dumped Tanya's body. Now, the newspapers had published the general location of where the body had been found, but certainly not specifics. So Ingram knew that if Laverne could point out the exact spot, well, that meant she was telling the truth. As they began to get closer and closer to the spot Ingram knew was the spot. He sort of felt his heart rate pick up, but he didn't drive any faster or slower. He didn't signal that it was coming up. He just kept on driving, steady, going straight, sort of expecting Laverne to call it out any moment. But the cruiser drove right past the actual spot where the body had been found, and Laverne didn't say anything. For a few minutes, they just kept on driving down the road in total silence, and Ingram's feeling really disappointed here. And as they're driving along, suddenly Laverne says, "Hey, wait a minute, turn around." So Ingram did, and soon they were headed back the way they'd come. And this time, when they passed the actual crime scene, so the actual spot where Tanya had been found, Laverne called it out and said that's where she was. Stop. As Ingram parked the car, he looked back at Laverne, who was staring intently out the window, right at the exact spot on that slope right off the highway where the body had been found. Then, once they were parked, all three of them got out of the car, and Laverne went over to the edge of the road and pointed, like right to the exact spot where Tanya had been found on this slope. And even though Ingram tried to keep his expression neutral here, internally he was sort of amazed. I mean, clearly Laverne was telling the truth. It would have been impossible for her to have chosen that specific spot without having prior knowledge of where Tanya had been, meaning she was telling the truth. She must have been involved in killing Tanya. As they all climbed back into the car, Ingram knew they now had more than enough to formally arrest John and also Laverne. She'd done the right thing by coming forward, but of course now there were going to be consequences. On February 21st, so 16 days after Laverne called with her first tip, John Sosnovsky was arrested. And 5 days after that, Laverne was arrested as well, and both of them were charged with murder. About 11 months later, Laverne's trial started, and at that point, Laverne actually tried to change her story again. She tried to recant her confession and said, "No, I didn't actually do this." But the jury didn't buy her change of heart and convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. As for John, 2 months after Laverne's sentencing, he was given the same sentence, life in prison. And that should have been the end of the case, at least from the legal perspective. But for the next 3 years following sentencing, Ingram just couldn't stop thinking about Laverne and John and Tanya Bennett. Despite what Laverne had done, he felt a lot of empathy for her. She'd obviously been under John's control and had seemed genuinely terrified of him. But more than that, Ingram had this horrible, nagging feeling that they'd gotten something wrong here. Then, one March afternoon in 1994, Ingram was in his office at the sheriff's department going over some paperwork when his desk phone rang. When he picked it up, it was the prosecutor who'd worked Tanya's case. And the prosecutor said they'd just gotten a very strange letter about Tanya's murder. And as soon as the prosecutor described the letter's contents, Ingram felt sick to his stomach. Ingram had been right to worry that he and his partner and really the whole legal system had potentially just gotten something wrong with this case. It just felt like there was something left unsaid. There was some loophole, there was some loose end something, but he didn't know what it was. It would turn out the thing that was wrong was Laverne, because their star witness, Laverne, was not just this sweet older lady afraid of her abusive boyfriend who had come forward and told the truth despite the consequences. That wasn't really the story. In fact, basically everything she told Ingram and his partner was a lie. What was true, and what ultimately drove Laverne to do what she did, was she really wanted to break up with John, but she didn't know how to do it. And so what she ultimately did to attempt to rid herself of John was to frame him for murder. And at first, she did an incredible job. She read everything she could, little details about the murder in the news. She also snuck a peek at Ingram's list of evidence during that early interview that was done at her apartment, and so that's how she knew about, that swatch of denim they were looking for. And she also just happened to take a few really lucky guesses, like when she pointed out the spot on the side of the highway where the body was found, she just guessed, but it happened to be right. However, the problem was, despite, basically nailing the framing of John and getting him wrapped up with a murder conviction, she also sort of inadvertently implicated herself. When she came out and said, "Well, I participated in the murder," her thinking was, they'll take pity on me and they'll blame John, he'll go to jail and I'll be okay. But no, she also got convicted of murder and went to jail as well. And Laverne and John were literally in prison, basically riding out their life sentences, when the actual killer, the real Tanya Bennett killer, sent a letter to authorities confessing to his crime. That was why that prosecutor called Ingram. It was to tell him, I think there's been a mistake. They clearly didn't do it. After the real killer was arrested in 1995, Laverne and John were both released from prison. In total, they both served 4 years in jail, all because of Laverne's lies. Our second and final story is called The Intruder. One morning in early November of 2023, a 71-year-old woman named Patrice Miller stood in front of her fridge in her little home in the rural town of Downeyville, California, and she saw she was running low on food, which meant it was time to place an order with the market in town, which delivered her groceries for her. Getting her food delivered was essential for Patrice and where she was at in her life right now. She lived alone and had a whole house to take care of, which was definitely getting harder the older she got. She'd also had some health problems lately, so it was getting more difficult just to move around. She even had a walking stick just to prop herself up. As Patrice stood in front of her fridge, wondering what she was going to add to her grocery list, she heard one of her 2 cats meowing outside, and this reminded her that amongst some other chores, she needed to feed her cats. So she decided to make her list later, and she just closed the fridge door, put some cat food in a bowl, and then grabbed her walking stick and headed outside. Patrice carried the cat food out onto the porch. She had some other things to do outside, but she couldn't hold a lot of things at once because of her walking stick. So once she had put the bowl down, she then headed back inside to get her compost, and then took that back outside to her garden. And she tried to do all these outdoor chores really quickly because she didn't like being outside these days. She had lived in Downeyville for a long time, but over the past few years, it had gotten really dangerous there. Now, she hadn't realized how bad it was at first because she mostly kept to herself, but eventually she learned that her neighbors were starting to get intruders on their property. There had also been a clear uptick in vandalism in people's yards and to their homes. And in fact, over the past few months, Patrice herself had begun to experience this directly. In fact, she had dealt with so many attempted break-ins at her own house that she had become convinced that she had a stalker. She'd even put bars on her windows as a security measure. So that's why Patrice did not like being outside. She felt exposed, like her stalker or whoever it was that was doing this was going to be watching her and would come over here and attack. And so as fast as she could, she dumped the compost in her garden, turned around, hustled inside, and shut the door behind her. And as soon as she had done that and was safely inside her house, she felt hugely relieved. A few days later, on November 8th, at the market in town where Patrice typically got her groceries, a 55-year-old cashier named Cassie Koch rang up a customer at the register. But as she bagged their purchases, her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Patrice. Cassie was typically the person that delivered Patrice's grocery order, but over the years, they had become closer than just a customer-provider relationship. They were friends. In fact, these days, the two of them would speak on the phone fairly often, just to chat. But now, Cassie realized she hadn't heard from Patrice in days, which was very odd, both because of their friendship, but also because she knew it had been a while since Patrice made her grocery order. And so Cassie had begun asking around at the store and had found out that nobody else had heard from Patrice either. Now, Cassie knew it was possible that Patrice was just busy, and for pretty much anybody else, one missed order or even a couple missed orders wouldn't be enough to make Cassie worry. But in this case, Cassie was extra concerned because she knew about Patrice's stalker. And she knew that Patrice had even called the authorities about it, but they really hadn't been much help. Remember, this is a tiny rural town in California that had experienced a lot of exactly what Patrice was experiencing: break-ins, harassment, and other kinds of vandalism or damage. However, neither Patrice nor anybody else had reported any actual violence. So authorities were basically overwhelmed with a flood of what they considered sort of relatively minor complaints. And Patrice's situation really didn't seem much worse than anybody else's in town. And also officials just didn't have the manpower to deal with it. And so ultimately, all authorities did was just advise Patrice on ways she could handle it herself, which was why she'd installed those bars on her windows. All this is to say, Cassie knew that Patrice was genuinely terrified of her stalker, who Patrice referred to as Big Bastard. and she was worried about what the stalker might do next. So, after Cassie was done with her shift that day, she tried to get in touch with Patrice one more time. But when she couldn't reach her yet again, Cassie called the police and asked them to go do a wellness check. That evening, a deputy from the Sierra County Sheriff's Department drove up to Patrice's house and parked in front, and immediately he could tell something was wrong. The front door of her house was clearly smashed in, and there was a garden hose that was laying across her porch steps and was spraying water everywhere, like the water had just been left on. And so the deputy got out of his cruiser and he walked over to the house and he found the turnoff for the water on the side of the house, and then he walked up the front steps of the porch. And as he did this, he was constantly looking around and listening, trying to figure out what was going on here. I mean, he didn't know if there was an active threat inside the house. He had no idea what he was walking into. And so he's on the porch, and before going in through the front door, which was obviously, smashed open, he looked in a window to see if he could see into the house to gauge what was going on here. And when he looked inside the house, the first thing he saw was blood all over the floor. And at that point, he unholstered his gun. And so now, with his gun raised, the deputy stepped into the house. And he slowly walked through the living room, listening for any signs of sudden movement or an indication there was someone still in the house, but he didn't hear anything. And so there didn't appear to be an intruder present right now, but there was also no sign of Patrice. All he saw was that blood towards the front of the house. That was it. And so the deputy, he left the living room and walked towards the kitchen. And as soon as he stepped across the threshold into the kitchen, he breathed in and just kind of held his breath because what he saw was just chaos. All the cabinets were open, and all over the floor were remnants of all the food that likely was in the cabinets, like pieces of food and ripped up packaging and broken jars. A window at the far end of the room was also smashed, and the security bars that Patrice had put on the window were bent and hanging by their hinges. There was actually so much just debris and just chaos in the kitchen that at first, the deputy didn't register what was actually laying in the center of the kitchen on the floor. But then, when his brain sort of processed it, he realized what he was looking at was Patrice. At least, what was left of her. But she no longer looked human because her body had literally been torn apart. The deputy quickly left the house and called in his terrible discovery to the sheriff. And within an hour, Patrice's property was swarming with police and crime scene techs and a forensic expert who specialized in this type of scene, and detectives fanned out all across the area and began speaking to Patrice's neighbors. And because pretty much everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the same type of break-ins and property damage that Patrice had been, it actually didn't take long for police to develop a profile of Patrice's killer. Their conclusion was that very likely the killer was the same individual who was harassing everybody else. But what officials couldn't understand is why had everybody else experienced effectively minor vandalism, but Patrice went from minor vandalism to really excessive violence. And this required developing a profile of Patrice. And so as police searched for her killer, they were also working on reconstructing Patrice's movements on the final day of her life. And at first, in their efforts, really they were just stumped. I mean, all she had done on that day, as far as they could tell, were some basic chores. But as they dug into what those chores consisted of, they found two things that actually explained everything. It would turn out that every day for the past couple of years, Patrice had been making two terrible mistakes. She fed her cats out on the porch, and she emptied her compost into the garden. And these two actions ultimately were what sort of attracted her stalker, Big Bastard, to her home. Because Big Bastard was a black bear. He loved to eat cat food and kitchen compost scraps. And eventually, he decided that Patrice was food too. So on that day in early November of 2023, when Patrice fed her cats and emptied her compost for the last time, Big Bastard waited until Patrice was in bed and then broke into her house and savagely killed her. By the time the deputy arrived at Patrice's home, Big Bastard had been eating Patrice's body for days. And so what he saw in the kitchen was what was left of her. Black bears are not typically dangerous to people. In fact, Patrice was the first known black bear fatality in California history. But it was exactly that sort of lack of perceived danger, which is why officials didn't help Patrice or any of our other neighbors get rid of these black bears when they were coming into their neighborhood and causing all this property damage and all this alarm. They basically said, what's the worst they could do? One afternoon in November of 1980, 28-year-old John Reed sat at a table on a hotel veranda in the tiny village of Barcelos, Brazil, which was a 2-day boat ride up a river from the Amazon jungle's largest city of Manaus. And sitting across from John was the legendary chief of the Uga Mongolula tribe, Tatunka Nara. Now, John had been in Barcelos for about 10 days now, and in that time, he'd already spoken to Tatunka many times. But still, it was like every conversation they had gave John this incredible sense of awe. He really felt like his whole life had been leading up to this exact moment of being here in Barcelos, about to go on this grand adventure. So Barcelos and Tatunka were very far away from where John had grown up. I mean, this was a very foreign place. John grew up in San Francisco, California. But even growing up in those suburbs as a kid, he had always dreamed of coming here and literally meeting Tatunka. So it was like surreal he had really done this. And if things from here on out went the way John hoped they would, he might never have to even go back to America. Because John was on a bona fide quest. John was in Barcelos to be the person who finally found the long-lost city of Acacor. Now, there was almost no record of the city ever actually existing, except for in one book called The Chronicle of Acacor, which was by this author and journalist named Carl Brugger. Carl wrote that Acacor was the capital city of a 12,000-year-old civilization, similar to the Incas or ancient Egyptians, in that they'd lived thousands of years ago and had a big empire and an extremely advanced civilization for their time. But according to Carl, Acacor and its people were way better because they were descendants from actual gods. When the Europeans eventually came to the Amazonian jungle, the people of Acacor did not get wiped out because they went underground. And it was there, underground, that they rebuilt their capital and literally hid their civilization from the modern world. And in fact, the legend said that they actually still live there now, guarding a treasure that had been given to them by the gods. Now, most people called Carl's book complete fiction and said that its author just sort of made it up to make money. But John hadn't paid any attention to the naysayers, and any possible doubts that he had completely disappeared the moment he'd finally met Tatunka. So Tatunka was not only a famous chief who knew the Amazon like the back of his hand, but more importantly, at least to John, he'd actually been interviewed in Carl's book, and he was said to be the one known person who'd actually been to Acacor who was still alive. And here Tatunka was, in the flesh, sitting across the table from John in all his Amazonian glory. He wore just a loincloth, and he had that same turtle tattoo that the book described, so John knew he was the guy, he was the chief he'd been looking for. And to John, if Tatunka was real, well then surely everything else in that book was real too. Right now though, neither John nor Tatunka were saying anything, which was unusual because normally their meetings were very animated, as Tatunka regaled John with all these amazing stories about Acacor and what it was like there in his very heavily accented English. But hearing these stories hadn't been enough for John, who really wanted to know where Acacor actually was so that he could actually see it with his own eyes. Now, so far, Tatunka had not told John where it was. He'd said that the people of Acacor wanted to stay hidden, their survival depended on it, and so he was not going to give up their location. But today, John could feel that something was different. Because just a few minutes ago, John had asked Tatunka again about literally going to Acacor, and now Tatunka had been very quiet for a very long time, like he was thinking about whether or not to finally reveal its location. And so John patiently waited, and as he sat there in this really intense silence, it was like he could almost feel Tatunka's deep wisdom oozing off of him in waves. And then finally, in his soft, very fragmented English, Tatunka began to speak. Almost 9 years later, on an evening in the spring of 1989, John's sister, 35-year-old Sandy Reed, pulled into the driveway of her San Francisco area home and got out of her car to check the mailbox. Sandy had just gotten back from her sales job, and she was tired and bleary-eyed as she, reached into the box and sort of mindlessly pulled out a stack of mail. But as she began sorting through the mail, the return address on one of the envelopes made her stop. It was a letter that was postmarked from Germany, and Sandy didn't know anybody who lived in Germany. And so she really wasn't sure what to expect as she quickly ripped it open. But as her eyes scanned the lines on the page, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The letter was from a German detective who said that he was writing about her brother, John, and that they were sure something bad had happened to him. So John, Sandy's brother, had gone to Brazil almost a decade earlier to find the lost civilization of Akakor, and Sandy and her parents hadn't heard from him since he left. Now, during the first few weeks of John's trip, he'd written letters fairly regularly, but then his last message had come in late 1980, and after that, nothing. Now, of course, Sandy had been worried about her brother, but she also hadn't been that surprised he had gone radio silent, because Sandy and her parents were well aware that John was obsessed with Akakor, and not just that, he wanted to go on this adventure, find this lost city in the jungle, and then never come home. He wanted to stay in the jungle. And so they kind of figured that, maybe he found Akakor, or maybe he just found another village somewhere. But either way, the way they looked at it is John likely wanted to start a new life somewhere else, somewhere in the jungle, and that's probably what he had done. So for nearly a decade, that sort of became their line of thinking. But now, as Sandy is reading this letter, it was like suddenly her understanding of what was going on with her brother was totally and instantly fractured. Now she was both panicked and also totally confused about the idea that, one, John was in trouble, and two, why is the German police looking for her brother? Why is that happening? Why aren't American police looking for my brother? But as her eyes frantically scanned the page, she learned why. The detective said they were investigating the death or disappearance of John and at least 3 other people, including a German citizen, who apparently had been lured into the Amazon by a particular book about a place called Akakor. Now, this book, according to the detective, was complete junk. It was a fabrication. Akakor, not a real place. But the detective believed that someone was killing the people who came looking for it. Now, the detective said they had tried to investigate, but the Brazilian officials were being very uncooperative, and he wasn't actually allowed to go to Brazil to collect evidence to try to figure out what happened here. And so basically, he was stuck, but he wanted her to know they were looking into her brother. And so by the time Sandy finished reading this letter, she felt like, well, I have to do something. If the German police, if they can't go to Brazil, maybe I can. Sure enough, later that same year, in June, Sandy arrived in the city of Manaus in the Amazon and checked into her hotel. She knew from John's letters from 10 years ago before he disappeared that this was the general area he had been. And so her plan was, sort of roughly speaking, to search the city, turn it upside down, and see what she could learn. Now, obviously, this was a big undertaking. Manaus is a big place. But Sandy, at this point, was all in on this mission. Sandy didn't really know why. For 10 years, basically, she had no idea what happened to John. But it was like now, she felt like she was being called to do whatever she had to do to go find her brother. So she had quit her sales job, emptied her savings account, bought a flight here, and brought along a tape recorder, like an audio tape recorder, so that she would basically, not miss anything, talk to everybody and learn whatever she could and track it. And her plan basically was to just spend all her time interviewing locals, recording what they say, to try to figure out if anybody knew about John or Akakor. But almost as soon as she actually began doing this on the ground in Manaus, she realized how hard it was going to be. I mean, it had been almost a decade since her brother had gone missing. So when she met with the Brazilian law enforcement, they had virtually no details about his disappearance and really couldn't tell her anything useful. And when Sandy spoke to local residents, all she heard were endless rumors with no actual evidence. And on top of that, all the rumors she heard sort of contradicted each other. Some said a white man matching John's description had just recently been seen on the outskirts of Manaus. But then another person claimed John had been shot years ago and his bones had been found deep in the jungle. And then yet another person said, nope, none of that's true. What really happened is John found a tribe in the Amazon, not the people of Akakor, but another tribe, and he had decided to just live with them. Now, even though all this information she was getting was sort of all over the place, there still was one common reaction that almost everybody Sandy spoke to had: fear. Each time Sandy asked about Akakor, people would sort of clam up, like they were scared of it. Now, they all clearly knew about it, and most of the time when she brought it up, she was warned to sort of leave it alone, like don't talk about that. And that in some ways, looking for Akakor could get her in trouble or even killed. So as the days wore on, Sandy just felt herself feeling more and more confused and anxious. And each night, as she laid in her hotel bed, she wondered if she should just give up, that this was impossible. But then it was like every night after she'd drift off to sleep, she would have a dream about John. It was like he was haunting her. And he would say to her in these dreams that Akakor was not what he thought it would be. So just about every morning when she woke up, she'd have this sort of refound sense of purpose, and she would continue to look for her brother. But it just kept going nowhere. However, during her last few days in Manaus, based basically on finances, like she was running out of money and would have to go home soon, during that time period, she heard another rumor. And that was that John had gone into the jungle to find Akakor, but he hadn't gone in there blind. A local chief named Tatunka had told John how to get there. Now, by this point, Sandy had spent 3 weeks in Manaus and its surrounding areas and really felt completely overwhelmed. I mean, she really hadn't made much progress anywhere. There was definitely a sense of fear around Akakor, and she was even starting to feel that like looking into this could potentially get her into trouble. And in many ways, hearing about this new person, Tatunka, whether they were real or not, it actually made her scared. She would love to learn what he knew, to go find Tatunka and see if he knew where her brother was. But there was also a part of her that just feared even pursuing this lead. It was like all of a sudden, Brazil just felt too overwhelming for her. And so after learning about Tatunka, Sandy's reaction was actually to pack up and leave. But after leaving Brazil, Sandy did not just, fly to California and give up on the search for her brother. She just decided to look for her brother sort of in a roundabout way. She had heard from a local in Brazil that there was a Swiss tourist who might have seen John in the jungle. And so after Sandy left Brazil, she went to Switzerland and spoke to this tourist. And then after speaking with that tourist, she flew to Germany and she met with that detective who had sent her the initial letter she got. But neither the tourist nor the German detective had any new information. So by the end of all that, Sandy still had no answers. And by this point, she also had no money. She had completely drained her savings account trying to find her brother, and it had not worked. Now, Sandy considered just going home. I mean, she was broke, she was scared, and really she hadn't actually gotten anywhere in her search for her brother. But there was still one lead that she had not investigated, and that was Tatunka, because basically it just felt too scary. She'd abandoned it and left for Switzerland and Germany. But Sandy felt like now, if she never went back to Brazil to speak with him, she would never get any real answers. It felt like Tatunka was the key, and she had been cowardly. She needed to go back there. She needed closure. So she went back to America, but she only stayed long enough to earn some quick cash cleaning houses so that she could finance another trip to Brazil. On June 21st, 1990, so about a year after she had made her first trip, Sandy did return to Brazil. She took a small plane to the village of Barcelos, which she had learned was where Tatunka lived. This time, though, she brought some backup with her, a documentary producer and also a reporter. She felt a lot safer coming here with a group, but also she did want to draw attention and resources to eventually help her with her brother's case. When they landed at the rundown airport, Sandy and her small team deboarded and walked straight into the tiny village. In the time that she had been back in America earning cash, Sandy had done some research on Barcelos, so she knew by now that Carl Brugger's book, The Chronicle of Akakor, the book that, John had been so interested in that led him on this quest, had really spawned an entire economy in Barcelos, since tourists came to talk to Tatunka and to try to find it. He was in Barcelos. But as far as Sandy could tell, the tourist boom had not done much for the village of Barcelos. It was dirty and the houses were all very rundown shacks. She'd read that only about 3,000 people lived there, and between all of them, they only had one phone. And so as the group wandered around looking for a friendly face to give them directions, Sandy spotted a woman who was hanging her laundry up on a line outside her home. So Sandy approached her and asked if she knew where Tatunka lived. And the woman immediately nodded, which Sandy expected, because Sandy had not just read up on Barcelos, she now knew a lot about Tatunka as well. And she knew that basically everybody in this area knew his name. He was a renowned chief who'd once led an expedition for the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. And he was a hero too. One time he had saved the lives of a dozen Brazilian soldiers after their plane had crashed in the Amazon. So the country's secret service was actually in Tatunka's debt. And also, of course, Tatunka was interviewed extensively in the Chronicle of Akakor, that book, and was the only known person who'd actually been to the city and knew its location. But more recently, Tatunka had settled into a quieter life and was running a hotel and giving boat tours to visitors along the Rio Negro. And so Sandy got directions to Tatunka's hotel from this woman, and as Sandy and her team began heading deeper into the village to go meet this guy, Sandy felt a mix of excitement and also fear. I mean, there was just something sort of heavy about finally meeting this guy. Eventually, the group came to what appeared to be a very isolated-looking hotel surrounded by a wooden gate. And inside of the gated area, up on the veranda of this hotel, was this very lean, shirtless man with a turtle tattooed on his chest. And Sandy knew immediately from the tattoo that that was Tatunka. As Sandy and her crew opened the gate and walked towards Tatunka, she pulled out a photo of her brother and held it up, along with, an explanation of why she was there. And Tatunka, at first, just kind of listened and watched as they approached him, but then as he began to hear what she was saying, he smiled, and in broken English, he told Sandy he was surprised she hadn't come sooner. But Sandy didn't return his smile, because as she stared at Tatunka, all she could think of was how wrong everything was. Tatunka's face, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, none of it made any sense at all. It would turn out those dreams Sandy was having where her brother John would appear to her and tell her that, Akakor was not like he thought it would be, it would turn out that was correct. Akakor didn't exist. However, it was not just a fake city created by that author, Karl Brugger, to sell his book. No, it was something much, much weirder than that. That whole book was based almost exclusively on the stories of Tatunka, the legendary Amazonian chief who Sandy was now meeting, in front of this weird hotel. But Tatunka, the man standing in front of Sandy, was not chief of anything. In fact, he wasn't even Amazonian. In reality, this man parading around as Tatunka was just some random German man named Gunther Hawk who had fled Germany for the Amazon to avoid paying child support to his ex-wife in the 1960s. But when he arrived in the Amazon, he wanted to blend in, but he didn't speak the language, and he had this heavy German accent. So what do? Well, he created a whole made-up story about a long-lost civilization that he supposedly descended from, Akakor. The Akakor story was designed by this guy just to keep him from having to pay child support. The problem was, the Akakor story, the legend he created, worked too well. Gunther managed to convince local and even national authorities that he was an actual indigenous person. And then, fatefully, he also convinced this writer, Karl Brugger, that he really was from this lost civilization and sort of inadvertently created an entire tourism industry based on Akakor. And so when Karl's book came out, Gunther found himself in a bind. To keep his tourist revenue stream afloat, he had to keep pretending that Akakor was real and he knew where it was, while also never letting anybody get there. And both Sandy and the German police believe that to protect this secret, Gunther killed any tourists who insisted on actually visiting Akakor, including Sandy's brother, John Reed. Gunther Hawk has never been charged with murder and denies ever hurting anyone. John Reed's body was never found. The author, Karl Brugger, was shot to death in 1984 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and rumors still circulate about who killed him and why. And as of 2024, Gunther Hawk was confirmed to be alive and still living in Barcelos, and still insisting that Akakor is real. To this day, explorers still travel to Barcelos to try and find it. The second and final story for this episode is called The Parable. On the night of November 14th, 1994, 56-year-old DeWitt Finley drove his pickup truck up a snowy single-lane highway in the Oregon mountains. It was late, but DeWitt was incredibly alert, and it was taking every ounce of his concentration to not crash. It was snowing really hard, and the road was incredibly icy. Not to mention, DeWitt was towing a camper van behind his truck, and the van was sort of sliding around and causing DeWitt to feel really unbalanced as he drove. And so as he's driving along, white-knuckling here, all he could think about was how having taken this route was such a bad idea. So DeWitt was a traveling salesman, and he sold fancy camper vans, which was why he had one on the back of his truck, to drive it around from city to city and to show it off to potential new customers. He'd just been in the Oregon coastal town of Coos Bay and was now driving to Grants Pass, which was in the southern part of the state. Now, the drive should have only taken about 2.5 hours, but DeWitt had decided to take a longer, more scenic route that cut through the mountainous national forest. Except that now, instead of experiencing a tranquil, peaceful drive with lush, stunning Oregon scenery, he was stuck in a snowstorm and fighting his way up a steep, heavily forested slope with a cliff on one side. Now, for just about anybody, this would be a harrowing experience. But for DeWitt, he was especially out of his element. He was from sunny Los Angeles, California. He never drove in conditions like this. And he had only very recently moved to Montana this past summer with his fiancée and 2 kids. And while Montana did have some harsh winters, he hadn't experienced them yet. So this was really a novel experience. But DeWitt was a very religious man. And so as this drive was spiking his heart rate and making him so stressed out, he's white-knuckling his way up this pass, all he began to do was just quietly, internally pray. And for a time, this all seemed to work. Maybe the prayer was working. He was staying on the road. He was making his way. He thought, I'm going to get through this. But eventually, the truck began to slide on the slippery conditions, and DeWitt sort of panicked and hit the brakes as hard as he could, which caused the vehicle to slide even more. And then the next few seconds were just a blur of snow and darkness and trees. And then after what felt like an eternity, where he's thinking, oh my God, I'm going to go off the cliff, his truck slammed into a snowbank, keeping him from falling off the cliff. After that, everything went quiet and still. And for a moment, DeWitt just sat there, completely stunned. His heart was hammering in his chest and his whole body was vibrating with adrenaline. But after a few minutes, DeWitt calmed down enough that he was able to kind of assess the situation. Number one, he didn't go off the cliff. So that was a huge win. He survived. And then he checked himself out, and amazingly, he didn't appear to have any injuries. And also, from the inside, it seemed like his truck was okay too. Maybe he dinged up the outside, from hitting the snowbank, but it just seems like he slid off the road and he was basically okay. To DeWitt, this felt like a miracle. He immediately felt like all that praying he had done had worked. God was looking out for him and saved him. However, when DeWitt put his truck in reverse and attempted to drive out of the snowbank, his tires just spun. They couldn't get traction. And so he realized, yeah, I survived the crash, but I may not be able to move. And I am up in the middle of the wilderness of the Oregon mountains. It's snowing like crazy. What do I do? Also, it's the middle of the night. He doesn't have a phone, doesn't have a radio, so he has no way to call anyone for help. He also wasn't expecting to be stuck, by the side of the road, so he didn't have food or water or really any provisions. And he also hadn't seen another vehicle for a really long time. So he had no idea how frequently people use this road, especially in the winter. And also, he wasn't even supposed to be on this route. So if anybody went looking for him, they wouldn't look here. However, just as, panic began to overwhelm him, DeWitt took a deep breath, said another prayer. God had already saved him once, and DeWitt just had to trust that he would do it again. Somehow, DeWitt was able to calm down enough, maybe it was his faith, that he was able to sleep. However, when he woke up, it was clear, one, it's still snowing outside, but worse, it had been snowing clearly all night because his truck was now way more buried in snow. The snow literally made it all the way up to the edge of his window. It's like multiple feet of snow out there. And so DeWitt, he turned his car back on and he threw it in reverse again, seeing if maybe now he'd be able to back out, pretty unlikely, but as soon as he hit the accelerator, the tires clearly spun, he didn't move. Now, it was daylight, and so he's thinking, okay, maybe now I can look around and see a house, a building, or some sign of life somewhere in the distance, just to give me a sense of how close I am to other people. But when he looked out his window, all he could see in every direction were trees and snow. He actually couldn't even see the road anymore and had no idea where it was since he'd gotten all turned around during the crash. And so he's just like in this whiteout, basically. And so DeWitt, at this point, was trying his best not to panic. And so instead, he focused on, what do I have? What supplies do I have right now? And he sort of began looking around the inside of his truck. And he found he actually had a lot of useful stuff in here. There were some cushions and a sheet, so he could make a bed for himself to curl up in. And he could also use the truck's heater to keep himself warm and to melt snow for drinking water. He'd obviously just have to be, careful not to burn too much fuel. Also, DeWitt had the camper that was attached to the back of his truck, which you would think would be great for a situation like this. You can just live in the camper until you get rescued. Except DeWitt knew this was not really a real camper. It was a demo model. It was unfurnished, there was no heat, no supplies, nothing. It was really just a shell, so not that useful. But once DeWitt was done doing this mental inventory, even though in some ways he had basically realized, I have very little, he actually felt a sense of calm come over him. He felt like, what? I have enough to keep me alive for a while, and in that time, I'm going to be found. And so he would just leave it up to God to save him once again. 2 days later, the storm finally let up. But even with the now clear weather, the snow didn't melt. And then soon after that, another storm came and dumped more snow and ice all over his truck. Also, during this time frame, DeWitt didn't see any other cars or trucks or plows. So he had a feeling that the road he had crashed on was now so clogged with snow, it wasn't even usable. But even though at this point DeWitt was extremely hungry, he had no food, it's been several days here, he also was warm and dry inside of his truck. And critically, he was also hydrated. He'd been drinking plenty of melted snow, so he was, surviving as best as he could. And then also, to ward off all the negative, intrusive thoughts about what could happen to him out here, DeWitt had begun to pass the time by meticulously crossing off the days in his yearly planning calendar and also writing letters. DeWitt always carried around pen, paper, and envelopes inside of his work bag, which he obviously had with him. So he had begun writing to the people he loved, his fiancée, his sons, and even to his boss to explain what had happened and why he had missed work. And in each letter, DeWitt did not sound scared or sad. In fact, if anything, he seemed rejuvenated. He seemed happy. He would reflect on how much love and joy was in his life and how lucky he was to have that. And he would tell the people he was writing letters to, like his fiancée and sons, that he really wasn't worried. He knew he was going to be okay because God was clearly looking out for him. The days turned into weeks, but DeWitt continued to stay warm and basically comfortable and alive, even without any food. But DeWitt believed that his hunger actually was a sign that God was looking out for him. DeWitt had no idea how long somebody could live literally without eating. But after 2 months, DeWitt had tracked the days in his calendar. 2 months had gone by. DeWitt felt like, I should be dead. I haven't eaten in 2 months. But he wasn't dead. And he felt like that was a sign. God was keeping him alive for his eventual rescue. It has to be. On the morning of May 20th, 1995, a teenager, along with his girlfriend, drove up the same mountain road that DeWitt had been on when he got into his accident. And even though it was May, there was quite a bit of snow still, and the road was still quite icy. And about halfway up a particularly steep incline, this teenage kid lost control of his truck, it began to skid, and he went off the road and crashed into a snowbank. Luckily, The teenager and his girlfriend were okay. And for a minute, they just sat there kind of dazed. And then the driver put the car in reverse and tried to move, but the car wouldn't move. The tires just spun. So eventually, the teenager climbed out of the car to examine his vehicle to see if there was serious damage here or if he was just stuck in the snow. But when he did this, when he climbed out of his vehicle, he looked just up the road a ways, and off the side of the road, basically equal to where he was relative to the road, was another vehicle. It was a pickup truck with a camper attached to it that was clearly half buried in the melting snow. And so the teenager told his girlfriend that he was going to go take a look in case, somebody else had a wreck and they needed help. So this kid, he leaves his girlfriend and he hikes over to the truck. And when he gets there, he can't see inside of it. It's covered with too much snow. But he brushes off some of the snow, revealing one of the windows into the truck. And he looked in, and for a second, he couldn't quite see what was in there. But then eventually he saw it. And when he did, he just gasped and backed up. After DeWitt crashed, he was certain he was going to be rescued. He knew he was in an isolated part of this mountain. I mean, he clearly knew that, but he really believed that God was going to save him. He felt like it was God who kept him from going off the cliff, and now God was going to intervene and save him, that somebody was going to show up and rescue him, effectively because of God. So because of that belief, because of how strongly he believed that, DeWitt did not get out of his truck. I mean, he got out maybe to use the bathroom, but for the most part, he stayed in his truck. And unfortunately, had he just gotten out and really looked around, he would have seen there was actually a paved path that, due to the way the winds whip on that side of the mountain, the snow doesn't stick to the ground. And so even with a huge snowstorm, he would have seen a black paved path going down the mountainside, and he could have walked it down to civilization, and it would have saved him. But DeWitt was so convinced that if he just waited here, somebody would save him because God was going to save him again, he just didn't leave his truck. And then when he began to feel that incredible ache from the starvation, the fact that he wasn't dying, months in with no food, it sort of built that resolve inside of him that clearly God has a plan. Clearly. I should be dead right now, and I am not. I need to maintain faith, and I'm going to be saved. And in many ways, that's beautiful. It's poetic in some ways. But it ultimately led to his death. That teenage driver who happened to get into a car accident up on that mountain road, who then saw the truck and the camper, well, that was obviously DeWitt's truck and camper. And when the teenager walked over and cleared the window and looked inside, he saw DeWitt, who was deceased inside of the truck. DeWitt ultimately died of starvation, most likely on January 19th, which is the final day that he crossed off on his calendar.